Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Aliens and UFOs video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's do another entry here, once again based on one of your newer suggestions. This will be video number 5 of this latest go around, so I'm going to give it a pause after this and then come back to it later on. Video number 6, if you include the special edition one that I did a couple of weeks back. That was that special interview that I did with Christian where he talked about his own Men in Black experience. If you haven't had a chance to check that out, I'll include the link below because I'm thinking about doing more interviews later on as well. But yes, this is a brand new suggestion. What a way to end the series this go around. Very unique encounter, especially with regards to what happens at the end. The idea that a piece of food is somewhere out there in a UFO with some Martians definitely just ended things off with a bang. So it has to do with this. It's a very fascinating, yet again, another one-time encounter known as the Mince Pie Martians, which you're looking at here. So let's go ahead and let's talk about all the fascinating info associated with this occurrence. It is a perfect example of the unique, bizarre, wholly original, and so interesting stuff that I love talking about here on this series, the stuff that hardly anyone else knows about, and that's why it's a great way to share here. So what was this Mince Pie Martians encounter? Well, it's something that occurred a couple of decades back. In fact, you'll have to go to around January 4th, 1979 to be specific. You're going to a place that's called West Midlands, which is a tiny, I guess you call it tiny town located there in England. So if you go there during that time period, you'll have this person. Don't know if she's necessarily still alive right now, but she was there, and she had a very unique encounter that happened. Her name was Jean Hingley, and she was there living at that location with her husband. And on one fateful morning, that morning there in 1979, here's what happened. So she was there getting up in the morning and then having her husband off to work. She worked as well. In fact, more on that a little bit later. She worked, but it sounded like she was going to go to work a little bit afterward, so maybe later on in the day. Either way, though, she saw her husband off to work, and then I don't know if this was like, let's say, as she was waving him away, or if she already had him leave and then a couple minutes later something happened, but something caught her attention. And when she did so, she saw there was this bright orange sphere that came about on her garage. Maybe it was floating over her garage, or maybe it was actually in the garage. But either way, though, it caught her attention while she was in the kitchen. And when she was there and saw this orange light, then that's when she looked, and then suddenly she saw this. As you can see, there were these, what she described as 3 bizarre humanoids suddenly there in her home, and they was making this very strange buzzing sound. In fact, the way she described it was almost like a ZZZ, like if you could describe probably like a very fast fluttering of a hummingbird. That's the immediate thing that came to mind here. Let's talk about the creatures, or these aliens themselves. So these things were 3.5 feet tall. They had the most discernible thing, the most immediate thing you could look at was a butterfly set of shaped wings. So that was something that just immediately stood out. They were translucent. They seemed to be spreading and going about very fast, like in terms of a flapping manner, and they were glittering in other parts too. So translucent, glittering, fluttering. That's why, in other words, people thought, in her case, this housewife Jean thought that this was something involving more like a butterfly-like creature. And then the faces, though, were much more discernible, much more humanoid, and much more tied to the notion of what you think about aliens, or more specifically grays. Because here they were, they had these very large dark eyes, and then these very tiny slit-like mouths. So completely what you would imagine, again, having with all these other encounters that people had with the Greys. And then as far as what they actually wore, they had on this silver tunic, probably glittering as well, just like the wings were themselves. And then everything was topped off by this helmet that was also semi-transparent. And then there was this light coming up on top of it there. So there they were, standing in her garage and then standing in her kitchen, buzzing about. And the way she described it was they were floating through the air. So they were not touching the ground, they were actually floating in the air. And then they moved about the home, and they went into the living room area. Clearly, though, she was mortified at this point. The way she described it was she was shaking vigorously, and they in turn were just there. Like, they don't seem to be doing anything as far as dangerous stuff. They just seem to be observing her as she was observing them. And so they went into the kitchen. I'm sorry, they went from the kitchen area into the living room area, and then that's when they inspected something that caught their attention. She had a Christmas tree there. Remember, this was January 1979, so maybe that family still had their Christmas tree up, and they noticed it, and they started shaking it vigorously. Maybe they saw all the glitter within it. Maybe they saw the pretty lights as well. And they started communicating to her. It seemed almost like telepathically, but almost like it was something coming out from outside their bodies at the same time. In fact, they communicated her by asking her nice, like the word nice, in other words, whenever they were shaking that tree. This finally prompted her to react, and then she stated them to stop. Like, she almost yelled at them to stop, and then that's when they stopped, and then it went over to a couch that she was nearby. And this is where things take an even more bizarre turn. They actually went to the couch, and they started bouncing up and down. Imagine just like you would a set of children bouncing up and down on a nice couch, and that way almost like a trampoline. And here's what you have with these aliens. I mean, when I was reading this information, I could just be totally fascinated, just like her, just like she would be, but at the same time, just completely frightened about what would happen next, because all of a sudden you have these creatures, these childlike creatures that acting childlike, but they look obviously from something else, from another universe completely, and yet here they are in her living room. She finally decided to see if she could get some responses to them, and so she asked them outright. She asked them where they had come from, not fully expecting if they would understand what she was asking, or if they even communicated in any other way other than the previous questions that they were asking. And then they pointed upward, and then they said the sky. So they were understanding what she was asking, and they were completely replying in an intelligent manner. The way they talked as well, again, it was almost originating outside their bodies. And if you could describe their voices, she stated it was more than lines of a gruff voice. So I totally imagine something along the lines of somebody like a deep voice, maybe a heavy smoker. Gruff type voice is what came to mind with regards to that. Now, here's where things take another fascinating turn. So Mrs. Jean Hingley was someone that was considered a devout Christian. She was someone that heavily was a religious person, and so as such she had a picture of Jesus Christ right there on the wall. And so naturally she pointed to that picture and then asked, because the way they looked like, because they had these wings, because they came from the sky, she asked them if they were sent by God himself. And they responded. They said, in a roundabout way, they said, we know all about Jesus. We came down here to talk to people, but they don't seem to be interested. That was their response. That was their actual intelligent response to her with regards to her inquiry about God, about being sent by Jesus, something about those along those lines, and that they knew about him. Fascinating stuff. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that would just open up so many realms of possibilities when it comes to the origins of life, maybe something else in terms of religion. All of that from just that one single statement. That's why I love reading stories along this line. But they didn't stop necessarily at the couch. After jumping up and down, they again began to fly around the room. They began picking up objects, just looking at them, just examining anything else that was nearby. She described it as almost like as if they had magnets within their hands, because they were able to lift things up so easily. Anything that they touched, they were able to lift things up. And interestingly enough, she had a radio that was playing throughout this entire encounter, but it seemed to stop working after their visit. And then also her TV and some cassettes that she had as well also stopped working after their visit. So who knows what kind of electromagnetic interference these creatures had, but they definitely impacted those physical devices. And then here's where things finally come up with regards to the name, the Mince Pie Martians. Another fascinating term. So Mrs. Hingley, after a while of spending time with them and being comfortable with what was going on, decided, you know what, they are guests here in my home. Why not treat them as guests? And so she actually offered them a mince pie and a glass of water to all these. I think there were three of them within her room. She offered them this stuff just as if they were cousins, just as if they were family members or somebody else coming in from some official business. Here they were in her home, and she was offering them this dessert. And they took it. They actually took this stuff with them. But interestingly enough, they could drink the water, and they were very happy enough to do so. But because of their very, very tiny mouths, they could not fit any piece of the pies within them. So who knows if they were actually able to taste the pies right then and there. But that's why they're known as the Mince Pie Martians, because of what she offered. It seems so bizarre, but it seems so natural at the same time. It's someone trying to grasp the reality of things and realizing, okay, here I have these unusual guests. Why not make things more normal, so to speak, and then offer them these pies? And then things took another interesting turn, because when she started to ask him about where they truly came from, wherever their origins were, that's when they shot, she said, these laser beams out of their helmets. So remember I was talking about earlier that there was this light, it seems like, that was emanating from on top of their helmet. She saw these lasers shoot out from them, and it hit her forehead, and it caused this very tiny red scar. It was not there afterward, after a couple of months, but it still lasted there at least for that time period. So you could see at that time that tiny red scar, and that was from that encounter. I don't know necessarily if that actually answered her question, but they shot that laser beam, and it caused a little bit of pain to her. Things, though, finally ended abruptly because Mrs. Hingley, maybe she was wanting to take a little bit of break, trying to calm down a little bit, calm her nerves. She was a smoker, so she took out a cigarette, and as she lit it, that tiny fire, that tiny spark, suddenly frightened these creatures, these mince pie Martians. So suddenly that was it. They were gone. They, without a word, without any kind of expression, they quote-unquote glided themselves out back into the garage, back into that orange sphere that I mentioned earlier was hovering about, and they took, get this, they took their mince pies with them. And then that was it. There was a big flash and it was gone. No indication like this thing was flying about and then going off into the horizon. Nothing along those lines. No, it was just a flash and it was completely gone. That's what I was mentioning earlier about the idea that there's this pie potentially floating out there in this universe, in that UFO, because they took the pies with them. They took the actual desserts with them. I love reading stories like that because somewhere out there again is this piece of pie potentially being examined by these Martians, and it came from Mrs. Hingley. So she called the police station. She told them about the reports. There was a doctor that came by. Don't necessarily know if anyone believed her, obviously because of the original, very fascinating, very far-fetched type of stuff that people would consider bizarre. But the doctor examined her and told her to take 2 weeks off of work. So whatever she was doing in terms of her work that I mentioned earlier, she definitely called off work for 2 weeks, and then because of that, that allowed her enough time to recover afterward. She, though, was not frightened from the encounter. She didn't regret it. In fact, one of her quotes is that after they left, it made her feel like, after this encounter, warm and happy, as though she had been blessed from this experience. So that goes to show that with regards to this Mince Pie Martians encounter that this Miss Hingley had, this was something that was just there. All of a sudden, these aliens were visiting her home. She offered them dessert, and they were pretty nice about it, but it was that unfortunate lighting of the cigarette, which may have been misinterpreted for something else, that caused them to abruptly leave. The only other evidence associated with these Martians is there was some examination of the ground surrounding that orange sphere that I was mentioning earlier, and there was this oval-shaped outline that was there within the melting snow. It's too bad, though, because it's involving snow, it can only last so long. But if there would have been some kind of closer examination, who knows, there could have been like more evidence found there as well. But that's it. That's the one-time encounter known as the Mince Pie Martians encounter. What do you guys think? What a great story, when it comes to this type of encounter. If anyone has any more information, something else I might have missed, please post those comments below. Anyone from that area too, that have visited that location, maybe new family members there in the West Midlands who knows about this story too. I always love hearing and seeing the comments, and others do too, about your local encounters there. So, all right, everybody, thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.